Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. We'll get started with our webinar today. My name is Chelsea Benson, and I am the Training Services Manager at the North Dakota League of Cities. I do believe I know most of you that are logged on today, and I'm hoping to see a few of you tomorrow at Celebrate Cities Day. I think I noticed your name on the registration list, so we'll have a good day tomorrow. And I want to thank all of you for attending this webinar on service animals and the law. It's a good topic to cover. I know we've had a lot of questions about it here at the League, so I thought it'd be a great webinar topic, and I was able to find two great speakers for this topic today. So we have Cheryl and Scott with us today, and they will give us a little bit of an intro on themselves as we get started about who they are and kind of what they do. And they have a great PowerPoint set up here today for you to go over with. And I did put the handouts, which is just the PowerPoint handout format, on the website. And I sent that link to everyone in an email this morning. And the link is also in the chat box. You could click there and download those. They will be on the website from now on, so you can download those later if you didn't have time to do so this morning. A couple of other things is that this webinar is being recorded. So if you do need to leave early for some reason, that is fine, because you will receive the recording in an email, hopefully later this afternoon. I am out for a meeting, and then tomorrow I'll be out for Celebrate Cities Day, but I'm hoping to get it to you today. So if you do need to log off for anything going on in your office, feel free to do so, because you will get a recording. And one other thing is all of you are in listen-only mode, meaning that we cannot hear you. So how you will communicate with us is by using your chat box. And we encourage you to ask questions as they're covering the material. So if you have a question about anything they're talking about, go ahead and type it in your chat box. Your question will come directly to me, and then I will grab Cheryl and Scott's attention and get that question answered out loud so everyone can hear the answer. If you're more comfortable with waiting until the end to ask questions, you're welcome to do that as well. I will leave a few minutes to do so. So that is what I have. Scott and Cheryl, I will let you take it away.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Scott Burlingame, and I'm the Executive Director of Independence Incorporated, and we're a disability rights agency that is located in Minot and serves the northwest corner of the state. And, you know, in general, we work to help people with disabilities to live in an integrated life within the community. So part of that is helping to educate and inform around all kinds of disability rights laws, including the laws that apply to service animals, therapy animals, and emotional support animals. So,
hi, and my name is Cheryl Merck, and I work at the North Dakota Center for Persons with Disabilities. And I work on a project called the Money Follows the Person Housing Program. And so my job is to help people transition back into the community from nursing homes or intermediate care facilities. And then we also advocate for housing for people with disabilities. And so one of the topics that comes up all across the state over and over again is the support animals, the service animals, therapy animals, and emotional support animals. So we're going to go ahead and get started for you.
So what is a disability? For the purposes of what we're talking about today, we're going to use the ADA definition of what a person with a disability is. And that's a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. So when we talk about major life activity, that would be something like learning, walking, hearing, breathing, eating, functioning in general. So those are all going to be kind of covered. So it's going to be a kind of a broad range of conditions that would fall under that term of disability. And it would include people who have that condition, but also people who have a record of such impairment, even if they don't currently have that disability. That comes into play a lot of times, say with somebody with mental health issues. So maybe their mental health is in regression. They don't have a problem right now, but they have that history of it. And then the third one is individuals who don't have significant disability, but are regarded as having a disability. And sometimes that might be maybe a physical marking or something like that that maybe looks like it might make people uncomfortable. Cheryl gave an example the other day of somebody who was a child of a father who had AIDS, and people within the housing complex thought the child had AIDS, so they treated him as if he had a disability. Situations like that would be kind of that regarded as having a disability. And so the ADA makes it unlawful to discriminate against a person based on that person's association with a person with a disability. So that's kind of the broad range of disability. You can see in that umbrella that's off to the right there that, it does kind of range a bunch of different types of disabilities. So.
Okay, so why the confusion? And the confusion centers around most people use the words interchangeably. They'll think their emotional support animal is a service animal. They'll think their therapy dog is a service animal. And so what we're going to go through today is what the types of animals are and what laws cover for those animals.
So let's talk a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the ADA was signed into law January 26, 1990 by President George H.W. Bush. It's one of America's most comprehensive pieces of civil rights legislation, and it prohibits discrimination and guarantees that people with disabilities have the same opportunities as everybody else to participate in mainstream life. And this includes the employment opportunities, which is Title I, the purchase of goods and services, and which is actually Title III, which is most of what we're going to talk about today, and to participate in state and local government, which is Title II. So there's kind of three different parts of it. The ADA was also amended in 2008 to kind of modernize a little bit, and so that's where we've been at in the last almost 30 years since it was originally passed.
Okay, and then the next law that we're going to talk about is the Fair Housing Act. And that Congress passed that in an effort to impose a comprehensive solution to the problems of unlawful discrimination in housing based on race, color, sex, national origin, or religion. And this dates back to 1968, when there was a lot of neighborhoods that were all white or all African American. And so the Fair Housing Act also includes people with disabilities. And so in North Dakota, the Department of Labor is the ones who enforce the Fair Housing Act, and they're under the guidance of HUD when they do this. And if somebody feels that they've been discriminated against, they can contact the Department of Labor. They will research the claims, and they're neutral. They're not for the tenant or the landlord, or even a city. They will research it as a neutral party, and they have a short time frame to turn around on this. I think it's 60 days that they have to come up with a judgment on it. And so most people think that they are for the tenants, but what we have come across is, yep, they are totally neutral when they are doing this.
So the Air Carriers Access Act is another one, and this dates back to 1986, and it prohibits commercial airlines from discriminating against passengers with disabilities. One of the things is that the experience of flying is very different, because things like the Americans with Disabilities Act don't actually apply. So you have narrow aisles. Anybody that's ever been on a plane knows they're going to be narrow. So they're not wheelchair width. And so there's just a kind of an entirely different set of rules around it. They're designed to minimize special problems for travelers with disabilities as they go through that process, and requires all, and a big part of this too is it does also require that the area around the airport is also accessible, which includes websites but also the kiosks, and, the security, TSA, and all those all kind of fall under that. And so before you get on the plane, it's kind of similar to the Americans with Disabilities Act, but once you get on the plane, it's under the Air Carriers Access Act, so it's slightly different. And the thing that we'll talk about in this a little bit is that this is actually, there's a lot of things happening every day under Air Carrier Access Act. There's different rulings coming out from different courts around the country, and there's also different standards being put out by different airlines. So it's actually, a fresh issue that as you deal with it, it's probably important to kind of pay attention to what the most recent news is, because things are changing very fast right now.
With that, we also encourage people to check with the airlines. I think we've all heard stories about people bringing on peacocks and squirrels and things like that. So we encourage anybody who's traveling, if you're traveling with an animal, to contact the airline before you get to the airport to kind of get the problem solved before it's time to get on the plane.
And you're going to hear Cheryl and I say that a lot today, that communication is extraordinarily important throughout this whole process. And we probably, just as a disclaimer, animals in general are an emotional thing. Other than children, it's probably the thing people are most emotional about. So it can be hard to communicate, but I think that's one of the ongoing things, much like Cheryl just said. When you're going to travel with what you believe is an animal that falls under the Air Carrier Access Act, it's very important to make that call to the airline and see what is allowed and what isn't allowed, because as I said earlier, those policies are coming out almost weekly now with changes and everything else. So it's very, very fresh. So what is a service animal? A service animal under the ADA is a dog, or in very rare cases, a miniature horse, that has been individually trained to work or perform a task for an individual with a disability. This task must be directly related to the person's disability. Whenever I say miniature horse, people always kind of get like, what on earth are you talking about? The miniature horse is only about a foot and a half off the ground. Yeah. So it's extraordinarily tiny. I've never saw one. I kind of would like to see one sometime. So this isn't like a pony. This isn't somebody bringing something, pulling it off the farm and just a small horse. This is a really small thing, and it would also be trained to perform a specific task. So.
Okay, and as Scott had said, the service animal is only a dog or a miniature horse. It's not a cat, it's not a lizard, it's not a snake or a peacock or a squirrel. So a dog who falls under a service animal cannot be limited in size or breed. And I'm sure a lot of you are going, we don't allow pit bulls in our city. But a pit bull can be a service animal. And we'll get to that a little bit later in the slides. But with the miniature horse, people wonder why people would have a miniature horse, because service animals are so expensive, and the lifespan of a miniature horse is up to 30 years. And so with some disabilities, it's much better to have a miniature horse. I don't know that I've ever seen one in our state, but the videos that I've watched, they wear little shoes and they're housebroken so that they're just like a dog. And they usually range between 70 and 100 pounds. So two of the things that we really want to key on are, it must be trained to a specific disability, and it must be related to that disability. So the animal, I'm going to use my dad for an example. My dad has a sight impairment, a hearing impairment, and diabetes. He could actually have 3 different service animals. And he couldn't have one that detects a seizure, because my dad doesn't have seizures. So your service animal needs to directly relate to that disability. Seeing eye dogs. You're not going to have a seeing eye dog for somebody who suffers from instability when walking. So when a person has a service animal, you can ask, does this service animal perform a specific task, and is it directly related to the disability? So another thing is, people like to call the service animal pets, but they're actually equipment and they're working animals. So it'd be very similar to having a wheelchair. And so when people say, oh, we need to charge them a pet deposit, or pets aren't allowed in here, if a person came up with a wheelchair, we wouldn't expect anybody to say, well, you're not allowed in here with your wheelchair, or we're going to charge you extra for apartment rent because you have a wheelchair. And so we want to make sure that that's perfectly clear. These animals are actually equipment so that the people can enjoy their lives.
Yeah, and the one thing is too is that a lot of us understand the idea of what we used to call like a CNI dog, like somebody that's blind having a dog that guides them. But there are many, many, many other things that would really kind of blow your mind sometimes that service animals can be trained to do. One of my favorite stories is I have a friend who has extreme asthma to the point where she was having like up to 200 asthma attacks a day. And she ended up getting a dog that was specifically trained to alert her to when she was beginning to have an asthma attack. And so the dog can actually alert her before she knows that she's going to have it. And has taught her to do, she's worked with her doctor to learn some therapeutic breathing. And she went from having, like I said, about 200 asthma attacks a day down to about 2 or 3 a week. So it's been that significant. And this is a dog that looks like, I mean, if you didn't know better, it's not a big German Shepherd. It's just a little lap dog, kind of a little yippy thing, you know. But that dog was specifically trained for that purpose. So there is really a wide range of things that people can be trained on when it comes to using service animals.
So we want to just make sure that we hit on the animal must be trained to be a service animal, and that training must be related to their specific disability.
Yep. And well, we'll come back. And I'll just go ahead and say this now too, is that service animals too they're covered. When we talk about service animals, we're talking about under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, okay.
So I'm here trained to work, and the task must relate to the disability. There's dogs who detect seizures. There's dogs who detect high and low blood sugar. They provide stability for their owner. My son manages a building, and one of the people in there has a dog because she has problems with her legs. That dog is a huge dog, probably about 250 pounds. It pushes the elevator buttons for her, and it keeps her stable so she doesn't fall. For hearing impaired, I think when you guys have fire alarms and things like that, you'll see the blinking lights. Those are for people who are hearing impaired and won't be able to hear it. So the dogs can detect those things. They can pick up phones and carry them to their owners. With post-traumatic stress disorder, the dogs can detect the anxiety or the panic attack, and they'll calm their owner down or distract them from what is happening. A CNI dog, and I thought this was great when I was doing some research, they're referred to as intelligent disobedience. And this means that they ignore commands that will put their owner in danger. So if their owner is trying to walk across the street when the light is red for them, these dogs will be disobedient and keep their owner safe on the curb. They also make sure that the owner isn't stepping off someplace that would be unsafe for them. So I thought that was kind of a great term, intelligent disobedience.
Okay, so when you're in public, the owners do have responsibilities. First and foremost, the animal must be under control at all times through a leash, voice, or hand signals. So you don't get an opportunity for a service animal doesn't get to run around and, jump on other people or get petted by other people or things like that. It has to be under control. Now, some people, of course, when you're talking about all disabilities, don't have the ability to hold a leash, so a leash might not always be possible, but that dog should be trained specifically to respond to commands. The owner is always responsible for cleaning up after the animal in a timely manner. Cheryl and I can both give some examples of situations when this hasn't happened and when owners haven't served well for their service animal, and it's absolutely unacceptable that if a dog does make a mess, the owner is responsible for that. If a dog does happen to damage anything, the owner is responsible for that. So there's no exception to our protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act to protect from that. And the animal should be licensed or vaccinated according to the local laws and standards that are out there. So,
and going back to what Scott was saying, they need to be picked up in a timely manner. That goes back to communication. What is considered a timely manner? If the person is unable to clean up after their animal, but they have a caretaker who comes in a couple times a day, the communication of, yeah, as long as it's picked up by the end of the night or within 4 hours. So a lot of that is communication with the people of what's going to work,
Yep, and the other thing we'll kind of throw in here too is that there is currently a where's the next one? There is currently a bill in the North Dakota legislature that was passed the House a week or so ago that will now be going to the Senate that will make it a fine of $100 to illegally claim that your pet essentially is a service animal for the purposes of gaining access to a public building or to housing. It's an interesting law. I understand completely where it came from. I'm not sure how enforcement's going to work on it, but when we talk about this, and that can be one of the most frustrating things, something I think both Sharon and I agree, and we don't want to see people abuse disability rights laws to bring their pet into public places or to have a pet, to get around a no pet policy. We recognize it happens, and so we want to make sure that, that everybody hears us, that we don't necessarily like that either, but we also want to make sure that the effort to prevent that from happening doesn't prevent people who legitimately need a service animal, or when we talk about emotional support animals later. So it's an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
We do have a question.
Okay.
The question is, how does the leash law apply when the individual is unable to hold the leash?
So under the reasonable accommodations part of the Americans with Disabilities Act, cities and local governments are required to make what's considered, again, a reasonable accommodation to policies and procedures in order to accommodate a disability. Now, there's a little bit of inconsistent case law that I've read on this issue. Obviously, there are some exceptions. For example, Cheryl talked about the pit bull rule, and so cities and local governments have been allowed to put reasonable modifications to say that they can't be just off of a leash, that you have to, and they'll actually say, like, for this type of an animal you have to have a leash of this short distance. But in general, if it's not something that you can kind of prove that it's an undue burden, so if you have a dog that isn't necessarily, it kind of falls on that burden. Do you want to take a hack at this, or what are your thoughts on it?
Well, like Scott said, it would be a reasonable accommodation, and so the person can put in writing the reason that they are unable to abide by the leash law, and then the city can make an exception for that person because of their disability. With the pit bulls and things like Scott was talking about, the city can say you can have a pit bull for a service animal, but it must be muzzled and not be on a 6-foot leash, I believe it is.
Yeah.
It's either a 5 or 6 foot leash, and in control at all times. Now, if they're going to ban something, you can't ban by the specific animal, or it has to be by the specific animal. If this animal shows aggression, but you can't ban it by the breed for the ADA. So if a person has a pit bull, they're allowed to have that pit bull as a service animal as long as that animal is under control and does not show aggression to other people, other animals in the building.
Yeah. And that's a great point. And we want to make sure we do that. Just because an animal is a service animal, if there is, for lack of a better term, the dog can lose its service animal rights if it acts in a way that is, that you can justify put other people at harm or other property at harm. It's not, if it has one accident, that probably isn't enough justification. But if it, pees on your floor every single time it comes in, that might be enough justification to say, this dog is not following, or the owner is not following, they're taking care of their responsibilities. So
yeah. So basically, in a nutshell, if the person asks for a reasonable accommodation with the city, then the city has to look at that specifically for that person to make an accommodation for them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, what can you ask about a service animal? And this applies to any public place. So if somebody goes to Walmart with their dog, because it has to be a service animal, dog or miniature horse, what can you ask? And you can only ask 2 questions. Is this dog a service animal that is required because of a disability? And what work or task has this dog been asked to perform? You cannot ask them about their disability, even if it is apparent. If they have a white cane, if they are in a wheelchair, you are not allowed to ask them about their disability, and you are not allowed to request for the animal to show you what it's trained to do. So you can't say, hey, can you have a seizure so that I can see the animal showing you? things like that. So you have to be very, very careful of what you're asking.
So where can a service animal go? You know, a service animal is able to go anywhere an owner can go, with few exceptions. The animal can go into stores, restaurants, hospitals, nursing homes, gas stations, hotels, and things like that. Not allowed into operating rooms or pools. I always giggle at that a little bit because I guarantee you somebody tried going swimming with their service animal at one point. And the animal is allowed to live in places that have no pet policy. So, and we're going to talk a lot more about fair housing here in a little bit, and kind of those rules and how that all falls into play. But the key is and I'll get calls every once in a while. I'll be like, you know, I was telling Cheryl about a situation. I had a friend of mine who's a business owner of restaurants, and he was like, can this dog come in here? Is a dog here going to get into my food and everything else? And the answer is yes, that dog is allowed under federal law to come into a restaurant. It is allowed to go into most places that people, you know, are able to go. So I think it's pretty cut and dried.
Yeah, and you'll most likely be able to tell if it's a service animal. A service animal is going to behave. It's not going to be sitting up in the booth with the person with its head on the table. It's going to go with a go under command, and it's going to sit underneath the table, and most people won't even realize that animal is there. Yep. He's not going to be begging for food. With the pool that we talked about with no community pools, they are allowed to go on the deck of the pool, but not into the water. Okay, our next group of animals are the emotional support animals. And the most important thing to remember with this is people have disabilities that are invisible. You're not going to be able to tell if somebody suffers from depression or anxiety. So questioning them, you're kind of walking a fine line if you're saying, well, I need to know why you have this animal. This group also causes the most headaches for landlords and businesses, because even people with disabilities sometimes think their emotional support animal is a service dog, because they also get confused with the words. Emotional support animals are allowed to live in places with no pet policies, but they are not allowed in public places. So you're not going to have an emotional support animal going to a restaurant or to the gas station or things like that. One of the headaches that's caused by this is people sometimes, when they don't have a disability but they want to keep their pet, they can go online and apply for a note from a doctor that they've never met before in a state they've never been to before, and get certification for that. And I went on there one day and I got to the point of adding my credit card, and I was able to get an emotional support animal from a person I had never spoke with and never told them about a disability or anything like that. So that causes a lot of headaches, and it's very hard for people who actually have disabilities when people are taking advantage of the system. Then with emotional support animals, it can be any animal. It can be a snake, an alligator, it can be, you know, a hedgehog, a cat. So with the service animals, only a dog or a miniature horse. With emotional support animals, it can be anything.
And if you guys leave this webinar today with nothing, I hope that you leave with at least understanding that service animal and emotional support animal are separate things. I mentioned that bill that's going through the legislature right now. It does not differentiate between the two. It says service animals and talks about fair housing. Well, that is, when we talk about emotional support, that they're not classified. There's a legal definition or difference between a service animal and a emotional support animal. So it's extraordinarily important to remember that and be able to use that. And then, of course, the third definition would be a pet. They are three different things legally. Yeah. So,
and I'm going to give you a quick little story on emotional support animals. We hold landlord trainings throughout the state with our project, and we have somebody come and speak on service animals, and we talk a lot about the differences and the Fair Housing Act. And one of the landlords told us that somebody in their unit had an emotional support snake, and the snake was supposed to be kept in its aquarium, but maintenance was finding the skin sheddings in the vents in the ceilings. So the snake was going back and forth. So I personally could never see how a snake is going to give me an emotional support, you know, but for some people that snake is their best friend and does provide them. But in that case, the landlord has every right to possibly start an eviction because that snake is not kept in their unit.
So an emotional support animal does not need to be specifically trained in a task related to a person's disability. So whereas we talked about earlier with support animals, they're trained. An emotional support animal is essentially there oftentimes for comfort, for relaxation, for companionship, issues around that. A lot of times around a non-apparent emotional type disability. But the animal does have to be well behaved. It must follow basic commands and be under the control of the owner. You don't get to get around, you know, that just because it's an emotional support animal. It still has to follow. It has to be a good animal, for lack of a better term. So.
And Scott and I, you know, we definitely see both sides of this, where people with disabilities, they need these animals, but people try and take advantage of it. We've heard from HUD, somebody had an emotional support cat, and their cat was lonely when they were at work, so they tried to get an emotional support cat for their cat so that their cat wasn't so lonely. So we look at that, you know, when we're advocating for people with disabilities, that really hurts when we're trying to help somebody who actually needs that animal.
Yeah, and just so you know, we have these conversations with the folks that we serve on a regular basis too, that, you know, this is how, what is required. And I have had people get mad at me before because they came into my office and they've wanted to bring their snake on the bus, and I was like, no, that's not a support animal, or it's not a service animal. So again, I said earlier that anytime you deal with animals, it's an emotional issue and emotionally charged. So, you know, we're equal opportunity make matter. People get mad at us from both sides of this.
So very similar to with the service animal, the owner's responsibility, the animal must be under control. The animal has to be cleaned up after in a timely manner, and they should be licensed or vaccinated. We have one of them here that's happened that Department of Labor has spoke about a couple times. Somebody had an emotional support bird, and they would bring them down into the commons area of their home, so into the kitchen area of the apartment buildings. An emotional support animal is allowed in there because that is part of the person's dwelling, but the bird was flying around and making other residents very uncomfortable. And so they were told, you can no longer bring your bird down into this area. It went to Department of Labor. Department of Labor made their decision, but it ended up going to some courts and things like that. The bird, they decided, should be allowed in the area in a cage so that it's not flying on other people, it's not getting in the food and things like that. That ended up dragging out for 2 years on something that could have very easily been handled with, hey, just put the bird in a cage. So a lot of communication there would have solved a lot of problems.
So what can you ask about an emotional support animal? HUD and DOJ, so HUD and the Department of Justice, have indicated in a joint statement that a reasonable accommodations under the Fair Housing Act, the housing provider is entitled to obtain only the information that determines whether the requested accommodation is necessary because of a disability. So in North Dakota, the laws are a little bit more narrow in North Dakota, but it has to be from a treating medical provider, and it has to be in the state too now, right?
I don't think so.
Okay. So it has to be, it's supposed to be a treating medical provider. So I have had cases where people have rejected it based on it's not a treating medical provider, but that can get a little bit legalese there. And so that's really it. You know, is it necessary because of a disability? But they are also able to offer suggestions for alternative accommodations. However, the tenant has the right to reject them if the alternative is, if they feel it's inadequate. So yeah, with the emotional support animals,
when they're asking for the reasonable accommodation, we ask the people to provide it in a letter so that you're asking for it with your landlord, with the city. So if it's an animal that is not allowed by the city, if it's an emotional support chicken and that's not allowed in your city, the landlord is requesting the reasonable accommodation from the city for their tenant. So that's something to think about too. You can't just say, nope, we don't allow chickens, because if it is an emotional support animal, the reasonable accommodation is put in writing and very important.
Yeah, you hear that a lot. We've said that a lot. Is getting these things in writing. It's just so much clearer, and it's an important part of communication. And you can make, again, offer up alternative accommodations. Like, let's say that somebody wanted to get some massive Great Dane, and they're living in a 600 square foot apartment, and you're like, well, how about you try a smaller animal? So you can offer up other alternatives, or you can say, how about you maybe move to this apartment instead where it's closer to the door. But they have the right to reject that. Again, that's the thing. When we talk about deciding on what an accommodation is, it's about communication rather than absolutes. So where can an emotional support animal go? This is a big point of clarity here. The animal is not covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. That you do not have the right to take that into a public location, at least a public location where other animals are not allowed. The emotional support avenue is rather covered under the Fair Housing Act. So you cannot bring your emotional support animal into stores, restaurants, hospitals, things like that, unless that store, restaurant, or hospital already allows animals into it. So there's kind of a trend. There are some stores out there that are trying to come across as pet friendly right now. So obviously there you could bring your emotional support animal. But if an animal has in fact, my office here our landlord has a rule against pets in the office. So there's a sign that says no pets. If somebody came in with an emotional support animal, we'd ask them the questions, and we would ask them to leave with their animal because it's not appropriate. And a big part of that is that because it's covered under the Fair Housing Act, when we talk about housing, you can get around no pet policies as a result of this. And as Cheryl said earlier, cities and local governments cannot impose specific breed bans on emotional support animals. However, they are allowed to make rules to ensure overall public safety. So.
Okay, and then our third type of animal is a therapy animal. And that animal does not specifically help one person. They are brought into nursing homes, into retirement homes. A lot of times when you're watching the news after a school shooting or something like that, you'll see therapy animals brought in for the students. And so you look at it and you're thinking, well, is this covered under anything? Therapy animals are not federally protected. So you can't take them into restaurants. You can't take them over to the pool, and they're not protected with no pet policies. So therapy animals, they're the cuddly ones that everybody wants to sit and pet. And I know at our university, they'll bring them in during finals weeks for the students. They'll bring them into the libraries, and the kids will, take a little break and pet the dogs and calm down after the stress of studying for their tests and things like that.
We do have one question. Are there any restrictions in the home for control of the animal if you have a visiting provider, someone like a nurse coming into the home?
Okay, let me think about that for a second here.
Would you repeat the question?
Yep. Are there any restrictions in the home for control of the animal if you have a visiting provider, and then a nurse was given as an example?
If it's a service animal, it's going to be trained. So it will be, it's not going to be jumping up. It's not going to be barking, alerting, or anything like that if it's a service animal. With the emotional support animal, it's a little bit different because they are not required to be trained.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's a couple of different things that come into play here is that in that case, for that, say, nurse, it also becomes their work environment. And so they have the ability to be in a work environment that isn't, there's a safe working environment. So there's a few different things. I mean, honestly, my first blush at this answer is that you don't necessarily, that person still has a right to have that emotional support animal in their apartment. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have the right to allow that service animal to make uncomfortable in any way somebody that's coming in. So the services are actually optional, and so it's a little bit hard. And so I'm going to go back to communication here a little bit, but that's a tough question. Other than, I think it's important to lay out expectations. So if I'm a traveling person going into somebody's house to do home health care or something like that, I have the right to set certain expectations that animal doesn't bite me, or that animal doesn't jump on me, or doesn't, I probably don't have the right to say you have to, get the animal out of the house. And if the animal doesn't act properly, that goes back to that it's the role of the owner to properly control and be responsible for that animal. So.
I agree with Scott. A lot of it's going to be communication. At first thought on this, I'm picturing a nurse going into a home and somebody has, a huge snake that she's uncomfortable with. Through the communication, can that snake be put into its aquarium or whatever so that it's not able to come out? Or can it be put into another room so that the nurse doesn't have to see it? So I think a lot of it's going to come down to communication, but yeah, it does come down to the safety also.
Okay. Thank you so much.
So, and this goes along with a little bit of what we were just saying. What if there's competing disabilities? And this happens. So occasionally there are two people who qualify for protections under disability rights laws, and they can request accommodations that compete with each other. An example would be somebody who's living with PTSD who cannot stand to be around dogs. And then you have somebody else, say in the same building, who has PTSD, who has a service animal trained to prevent panic attacks. So these are both people under the laws that have protections, but yet their disabilities kind of cross over, their accommodations cross over. And as we continue to say, communication is the key here in these situations. And accommodations can and should be provided to best accommodate both. So, for example, maybe, if it's a multi-unit housing, maybe the person that has the dog is near a door that can quickly go out so the dog doesn't run around the hallways. Or maybe they have separate doors or things like that. Cheryl, you have an example of that?
Yeah, we've had one landlord where somebody had an allergy to dog dander, and a person also had a service animal. And so the landlord had one person on one side of the complex and the other person on the other side. And the dog was taken out one door, and the person who had the allergy was using a different door so that dander wasn't there. Plus, they had their maintenance vacuuming more frequently to make sure that the dog dander was picked up to help the person with the allergies.
And you have to be careful here, but again, you don't have to say, even in that case, you don't have to say, I have a reasonable accommodation from the tenant in unit 215 that says they can't be around pet dander. But what you can say is, I have a reasonable accommodation request that is conflicting with this, so in order to best accommodate you, I need you to go out this door. You don't have to necessarily lay out every situation other than kind of using that language. That my intention here is to provide reasonable accommodations to two different tenants who have protections under federal disability law, and we're going to work it out and try to kind of stick as basic to that and as simple to that as possible. So let's move on to what our reasonable accommodation. A reasonable accommodation is an adjustment to make a fair system for a fair system for an individual based on proven need. Accommodations can be made in the structure of a facility as well as the provisions of services. So we've talked a lot about the fact that with dogs and stuff like that, but there can be accommodations to kind of your daily activities, the way things are done within your organization too. So let's say that you have, I'm trying to think of a good example right now. So say you have a public event, and as part of the kind of that a picnic, let's say, in front of the animal. So you can say, we're going to allow dogs, we're going to allow an accommodation to allow support animals that one day to be out in the yard, or things like that. So accommodations can be made that kind of go above and beyond. But they don't need to be made if providing that disability causes an undue hardship. Undue hardships are very subjective, and they're going to vary a lot based on need, but undue hardship is not just an inconvenience. But if there's some reason that something's too expensive, if something is too difficult, if it causes too big of a hassle, you can allege undue hardship. But like I said, if it's something that can be accommodated or is being accommodated elsewhere in similar situations, it's going to be much more difficult to prove. What is a city's responsibility? So Title II of the ADA prohibits discrimination in all public areas on a local, city, county, or state level. City entities must comply with Title II regulations according to the United States Department of Justice. These regulations cover access to all programs and services offered by the entity. It includes the physical access as described under the ADA standards for accessible design, and programmatic access that might be obstructed by discriminatory policies and procedures to entities. So let's go back to service animals in public. So service animals are covered under the ADA. They're allowed to be in the public. So therefore, any city function should allow for service animals to come along as well. So that might be, if somebody wants to come in and pay their water bill, they're allowed to bring their service animal in, of course. If somebody is coming to a city council meeting, they'd be able to bring their service animal to that city council meeting. If somebody is coming to vote in a municipal election, they'd be able to bring their service animal along. So really, when we're talking about service animals, cities are very much fall under the same expectation of public entities such as businesses, stores, hospitals, and things like that.
We kind of look at it, substitute wheelchair for service animal. So if somebody's coming in to pay their water bill, you're not going to say you can't have your wheelchair in here. Or going to a parade downtown where the animals aren't allowed, you're not going to say you can't have your wheelchair down here. So you can't say you can't have your service animal here.
Yep. So this little slide here is one of my favorites, because it's how do you decide if it's a legitimate support animal. So this breaks it down very much based on what is a service animal and what is a support animal. And as you can see, a service animal has to be specifically trained for a task. An emotional support animal does not. A service animal is allowed by federal law for the Air Carriers Act to accompany the handler on all flights. An emotional support animal in that case may also be allowed under the Air Carriers Act to accompany somebody. That's why, as Cheryl said, sometimes people are bringing their birds or their peacocks on. That's one of the things they're trying to kind of narrow down a little bit. But right now, potentially a cat, for example, could potentially be brought on an airline, because some airlines still allow that. Service animal is allowed to, by federal law, to, as I said earlier, to accompany them in restaurants, stores, movie theaters, etc. A certain emotional support animal is not. So service animal is allowed by federal law to stay with people who are disabled in apartments that have no pet policies. That's true for both service animals and emotional support. So if you have a dog that is specifically trained to perform a certain task, that dog is allowed to live in housing and to get around no pet policies, much like an emotional support animal is. Service animal is usually almost always trained to assist trained to assist one person at a time. As I said earlier, an emotional support animal is not trained. That is not one of the requirements. Service animal is usually does not provide emotional comfort to more than one person. So just because I have a service animal and my son might get a little bit of comfort from that, but it's not my son's service animal. It's my service animal. An emotional support animal might help an entire family. We have this cat. It's an emotional support animal. We have 2 or 3 people in our family that have mental health issues, and this cat is for all of us. A big one that we like to pound home, and you see kind of this, support dog identification card and this emotional support dog certification. You can get those all over the place. You'll sometimes see animals that have vests with those little, emotional support animal on there. None of those are required by law, and there's no national certification that's legitimate. Those are literally things that you can go online, as Cheryl said earlier, get mailed to you and put on your dog. That is not the legal standard for identifying either an emotional support animal or a service animal. It's not a bad thing to do for like community awareness. Like you'll see on as we said earlier with like guide dogs, sometimes people will put signs on there that say, you know, service animal, do not pet. That's perfectly okay. But if it says certified service animal, anything like that, that isn't necessarily legitimate. And there are a lot of companies out there making good money by getting around that law. So.
And I look at Scott's picture on there. The service animal is a working dog, and you look at that picture and he's very determined in working, where the emotional support animal is there to provide emotional support, and he's got the grin on his face. But one thing to remember is that service animals also, when they're not working, they are allowed out to play and things like that to get their energy out.
Yeah. And if you've ever had the opportunity to do it, if you're ever around like a service animal, and especially like we talked about earlier, a guide dog, once they take that vest off, the dog turns back into a pet. It's actually kind of cool to watch because they're so trained while they're working to act a certain way, and they're trained that once you take that vest off, that then they become a dog. And it's just awesome to me to watch that change in personality when that happens.
So how can you tell the difference? And I think we've gone over this quite a few times. The ADA for a service animal, it's going to be a dog or a miniature horse. Emotional support is any animal. And one thing that I learned in one of our trainings that really made a lot of sense to me is who's doing the work. So if somebody's having an anxiety attack or post-traumatic stress disorder, and the dog climbs up in their lap and starts nudging them and trying to get under their hand and things like that, that dog is doing the work. If you feel anxious or depressed and you are petting the dog, you're doing the work. So if you're doing the work, that's an emotional support animal. If the dog is doing the work, that's a service animal. If an animal is lunging, barking, messing in the apartment or in the businesses, that's not a trained service animal. Because a trained service animal, you wouldn't even know they were there most of the time.
And I want to point out one extra thing here is that in North Dakota, there is a law that goes above and beyond the ADA. North Dakota has a law that allows for service animals in training to come into public places. However, the business owner is supposed to be notified and give permission. And so if you're ever asked, you know, it's a nice thing to be aware of it, because often I have a friend of mine right now who's training a service animal, and she doesn't feel that she can actually take the service animal in training into a public place because she feels like businesses are so kind of, the pendulum is swinging in the wrong way because so many people are abusing these rules. So if somebody is legitimately training it, you can allow it in North Dakota. So just wanted to make sure I pointed that out as well.
Okay, and then finally, things to remember. These are animals, but they're not pets. A service animal is a piece of equipment similar to a wheelchair, and they provide the person with a disability the, I'm not sure which word I'm looking for, but to enjoy their community and to be living out in the community rather than in a nursing home or some type of facility. When you see a service animal in public, remember it's working. Do not go up and pet that animal or try to distract it from its job. And service animals do not need to wear vests, as Scott said earlier.
Yeah, and the no pet thing is so hard because people, when they see a dog, instantly want to run up and pet it or feed it or whatever. And it's so important not to do that. And I'll tell a little story that I've been using a lot lately. So I have a colleague in California who is a blind gentleman who about 1.5 years ago got a brand new guide dog. And so the training of a guide dog costs somewhere between $20,000 to $40,000 depending on need. So it's a pretty major investment. And in his case, his was about $20,000. And he got it and was going, he was in an airport is actually where he was, and somebody brought in a dog that was not under control, that was not a legitimate service animal. The dog attacked his dog and it ruined the dog. The dog lost all of its training and is no longer a service animal. It's going to cost him $20,000 because somebody abused that law. So as I said earlier, we're not really in favor, we're not here to advocate for people abusing the laws, and we will tell this exact story to people on both sides of this issue. But all that being said, we don't want to overcorrect either and make it so hard that when people legitimately do need service animals, that they're met with an unwelcoming door. So here's our contact information, and I guess with that, if there's any other questions, we'll take it at this time.
Yeah, thank you so much for all the great information. If you do have any more questions, you can go ahead and type them in that chat box and we will get them answered here before we log off. Cheryl and Scott, I just want to thank you both for taking the time to share all this great information. It was very interesting, and I hope it does help some of our city officials with a lot of the questions they've been having, and to just distinguish the difference between those, I think, is a big one, because I know there's a lot of confusion about that. So hopefully that helps out a lot. If you do have any questions, go ahead and type them in. Cheryl and Scott, did you have anything else you wanted to share with us?
I don't think so. I would highly recommend, though, just, you know, you can contact us at any time, and we're all trying to figure this out together. As I said earlier, sometimes there's inconsistencies, and sometimes case law comes along and changes what we're working on a little bit, but our best goal is to provide you with the most accurate information, even if it isn't necessarily always easy to hear. So
definitely. Okay, and like Scott said too, contact either of them there. They have their information. If you do have questions, I'll include their contact information in the email with the recording too. So, and always feel free to contact the league, and I can get you connected as well with any questions that you have. So I don't see any more questions as of now, so I will let everyone go. Again, Cheryl and Scott, thank you so much for your time. The league really appreciates it, and our members do as well. So thank you both so much, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their day.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.